The Parson family's Christmas party was in full swing. The living room glowed with twinkling lights strung across the mantelpiece, and the smell of freshly baked gingerbread mingled with the faint scent of pine from the towering Christmas tree. Guests milled about, laughing and chatting, their voices blending into a warm, festive hum. Outside, snow fell softly, blanketing the suburban street and muffling the world beyond the bright windows of the Parson home. Riley, the family's golden retriever, wandered between the guests, tail wagging as he accepted the occasional pet or scrap of food sneaked under the table. He was the heart of the Parsons' home, ever watchful, loyal, and adored by everyone. Riley's brown eyes gleamed with curiosity as he moved from room to room, keeping a silent watch over the joyful chaos. Then the doorbell rang, cutting through the noise of the party. The chatter quieted briefly as Mrs. Parsons moved to answer it, her cheerful voice greeting the late arrival. Into the warm glow of the living room stepped a man in a long gray overcoat. His face was angular, framed by dark hair that looked damp from the snow. He introduced himself as Thomas, a friend of a distant cousin who had extended an invitation. "Sorry I'm late," Thomas said, his voice calm but carrying a faint trace of unease. "The roads were worse than I expected." "Welcome," Mrs. Parsons said, ushering him in with a bright smile. "Let me take your coat. Come join us." Thomas hesitated for a moment, clutching his coat tightly before finally shrugging it off. As he did, Riley, who had been sitting near the Christmas tree, suddenly stiffened. His ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled from his throat. All eyes turned to the dog. "Riley," Mrs. Parsons scolded lightly, laughing to ease the awkwardness. "What's gotten into you?" The guests chuckled as Riley took a cautious step forward, his growl deepening. For a moment, the room's warmth seemed to dim. Thomas raised his hands in mock surrender, trying to defuse the tension. "He must not like my aftershave," he joked. The laughter resumed, though it was softer now. Riley's behavior was brushed off as quirky, but the dog didn't back down. He stayed fixed on Thomas, his body tense and his tail unusually still. Mr. Parsons stepped in, gently tugging Riley back by the collar. "He's just being protective," Mr. Parsons said. "Come on, boy, let's give Thomas some space." Riley allowed himself to be led away, but his eyes never left the new guest. He positioned himself at the edge of the room, lying down but keeping his head up, his gaze sharp and unyielding. Thomas seemed unbothered, blending into the gathering with polite conversation. He moved through the room with ease, smiling at stories and sipping the cider Mrs. Parsons had handed him. But Riley's reaction lingered in the minds of a few guests. Emily Parsons, the youngest member of the family, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Why is Riley mad at that man?" she whispered, her wide eyes darting toward the dog. Mrs. Parsons bent down, smoothing Emily's curls. "He's not mad, sweetheart. He's just being silly. Riley is always looking out for us, remember?" Emily nodded, but didn't look entirely convinced. She wandered over to Riley and sat beside him, wrapping her small arms around his neck. Riley leaned into her touch briefly, but kept his eyes locked on Thomas, his growl fading into a low rumble. As the evening wore on, the party returned to its jovial rhythm. Guests exchanged gifts, children played games near the tree, and the Parsons led a carol sing-along. Thomas remained in the background, engaging politely but never quite becoming the center of attention. He smiled often, but seemed to keep a cautious distance. It was during the gift exchange that Riley's behavior escalated. When Thomas leaned forward to accept a wrapped box from another guest, Riley suddenly shot to his feet, barking loudly. The sharp, echoing sound startled everyone. The room fell silent. "Riley," Mrs. Parsons said, her voice sharper now. She grabbed his collar, trying to pull him back, but the dog refused to budge. His bark turned into a snarl as he advanced toward Thomas, stopping just short of the man's feet. "Whoa," Thomas said, taking a step back. His face was pale now, and his smile wavered. "What's wrong with him?" "I don't know," Mr. Parsons said, stepping between them. "But he's never acted like this before. Maybe he senses something." One of the guests joked nervously, trying to lighten the mood. Riley didn't seem to care about the tension in the room. He barked again, his teeth bared now, and his body rigid. The laughter faded completely. All eyes were on Thomas, whose hand hovered near his coat pocket. "What's in your pocket?" Mr. Parsons asked suddenly, his voice calm but firm. Thomas blinked, startled. "Just my wallet," he said, reaching slowly into the pocket. "See." He pulled out a worn leather wallet, holding it up for everyone to see. But Riley's barking didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, more urgent. Mr. Parsons' brow furrowed as he watched Thomas closely. Something about the man's movements, his tight smile, didn't sit right. "Maybe we should take Riley outside," Mrs. Parsons said, trying to ease the growing discomfort. "No," Mr. Parsons said, his voice unusually stern. "Let him be. Riley's trying to tell us something." The room fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by Riley's relentless growls. Thomas laughed nervously, his fingers twitching at his sides. "It's just a dog," he said, his voice tight. "He probably smells something he doesn't like." But no one laughed this time. Riley took another step forward, his barking filling the space like an alarm. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Riley's growling filled the room, cutting through the awkward silence. All eyes remained fixed on Thomas, who stood frozen, his hand now clutching his coat nervously. The festive warmth of the party had evaporated, replaced by a palpable tension. For the first time, many of the guests started to question the man standing before them. Though he tried to maintain a composed smile, beads of sweat glistened on his forehead under the flickering Christmas lights. "Riley, enough?" Mrs. Parsons snapped again, pulling harder on the dog's collar. But Riley was unyielding, digging his paws into the carpet and refusing to back down. Emily knelt beside him, whispering softly, "It's okay, Riley, sure." But her attempts at soothing the golden retriever did nothing to quiet his protective stance. Mr. Parsons stepped forward, his years as a retired police officer surfacing in his tone and posture. "Thomas, I think Riley senses something, and I've learned not to ignore instincts like his. Is there something you're not telling us?" Thomas blinked, startled by the directness of the question. He let out a nervous laugh, though it carried no real humor. "I'm not hiding anything," he insisted. "Maybe he's just picking up on my nerves. Dogs are good at that, right?" Riley barked again, louder this time, cutting through Thomas's words. His ears were pinned back, his tail stiff, and his body bristled with an intensity no one in the room had ever seen before. Emily pressed closer to Riley, her small arms wrapped around his neck, her wide eyes darting between the dog and the strange man. "Maybe we should just have a look," Mr. Parsons suggested, his voice calm but firm. For everyone's peace of mind, Thomas's smile faltered entirely. His hand tightened around the edge of his coat, and for a moment, he looked like he might argue. But then he exhaled sharply, forcing a strained grin. "Fine, if it'll make everyone feel better." He began to open his coat slowly, deliberately, as if stalling for time. The room remained silent, the tension so thick it seemed to weigh down the air itself. Riley stayed locked on Thomas, his growling relentless and sharp. As Thomas hesitated, Mr. Parsons stepped closer, his posture becoming more authoritative. "Let me help you with that," Mr. Parsons said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Before Thomas could react, Mr. Parsons reached out and pulled the coat open fully. What spilled out of the folds sent a collective gasp through the room. Something metallic glinted briefly in the soft light of the Christmas tree, a strange device with wires sticking out. It tumbled to the floor, landing with a heavy thud that seemed to echo endlessly. Riley barked furiously now, lunging forward. Mr. Parsons moved quickly, stepping between the dog and the device, his mind racing. Years of training surged back to him as he bent to inspect it. The object was small but unmistakable. It was some sort of makeshift explosive, though it didn't appear to be armed. "What the hell is this?" Mr. Parsons demanded, his voice sharp as a blade. The room erupted into chaos. Guests scrambled away from Thomas, some clutching their children, others frantically whispering to one another. Mrs. Parsons stood frozen, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Thomas raised his hands defensively, his face pale. "It's not what it looks like," he stammered. "I swear." I wasn't going to use it here. Then why bring it? Mr. Parsons asked, his voice steady but cold. He stepped forward, his imposing presence making Thomas shrink back. It's complicated, Thomas mumbled. His gaze darted around the room, searching for an escape route. Riley's growling intensified as if daring Thomas to make a move. It better not be too complicated to explain right now, Mr. Parsons said. You've got a room full of witnesses, and the police are going to want answers. Mrs. Parsons, finally snapping out of her shock, rushed to the phone and dialed 911. Her voice shook as she explained the situation to the operator. Meanwhile, Riley stood guard near the device, his eyes never leaving Thomas. You don't understand, Thomas said, his voice rising in desperation. I wasn't going to hurt anyone. I needed a place to hide it for a while. That's all. I didn't think anyone would notice. Hide it, Mr. Parsons repeated, his disbelief plain. In a house full of children and families? What kind of monster does that? I panicked, Thomas admitted, his shoulders slumping. It was stupid, okay? I didn't know where else to go. I didn't think it would actually hurt anyone, and I'm supposed to believe that? Mr. Parsons said, his voice low but laced with anger. The sound of distant sirens began to fill the air. The authorities were on their way, but the tension in the room remained suffocating. Thomas didn't try to run. It was clear that any attempt to move would be met with Riley's teeth, and likely Mr. Parsons' swift intervention. Emily, still holding on to Riley, whispered, "He's a bad man, isn't he?" Mrs. Parsons knelt beside her daughter, pulling her into a tight hug. "You're safe now, sweetheart." Riley made sure of that. When the police arrived, they moved quickly to secure the device and apprehend Thomas. He didn't resist. His shoulders slumped in defeat as they led him out in handcuffs. The officers praised Riley, calling him a hero, and commended Mr. Parsons for his quick thinking. As the last of the commotion settled, the guests began to trickle out, offering words of gratitude and concern. The Parsons were left in their living room, the festive atmosphere irreparably shaken. Riley finally relaxed, curling up beside the Christmas tree with a heavy sigh. His job was done. Mr. Parsons sat down heavily on the couch, his hand running through his hair. "I don't even want to think about what could have happened if Riley hadn't been here." Mrs. Parsons sat beside him, her hand finding his. "He saved us," she said simply. "He saved everyone here." Emily climbed into her father's lap, resting her head against his chest. "Riley knew," she murmured. "He always knows." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in quiet. Inside, the Parsons sat together, holding one another close. They were shaken but safe, and all because of their loyal dog, who lay contentedly by their side, keeping a silent watch over the family he loved. The room had finally quieted, though the tension hung heavy in the air. The police had taken Thomas away, and the guests, shaken but unharmed, had dispersed with murmured reassurances and promises to check in the following day. The Parsons were left in their living room, the aftermath of the Christmas party evident in the half-empty cups, torn wrapping paper, and discarded decorations. Riley lay near the fireplace, his head resting on his paws, though his eyes stayed vigilant, darting toward every sound from the street outside. Mr. Parsons sat in his favorite armchair, his hands clasped tightly as he stared at the extinguished embers in the fireplace. His thoughts were a storm of conflicting emotions: relief, anger, and a gnawing curiosity about what could drive someone like Thomas to bring something so dangerous into their home. He turned to his wife, who was quietly gathering stray plates and cups from the coffee table. "We need to know more," he said, his voice low but resolute. "I can't just let this go without understanding why." Mrs. Parsons sighed, her hands pausing mid-motion. "The police will handle it, won't they? They'll investigate, figure out who he is and what he was planning." "Of course," Mr. Parsons replied, leaning forward in his chair. "But something about this feels personal. Why here? Why us?" Emily appeared at the doorway, clutching a blanket and Riley's favorite chew toy. She padded softly to the golden retriever and knelt beside him, draping the blanket over his back. Riley lifted his head and gave her a gentle lick on the cheek before laying back down. "Is Riley going to be okay?" Emily asked, her voice small and filled with concern. Mrs. Parsons knelt beside her daughter, pulling her into a hug. Riley's fine, sweetie. He's just tired. He worked very hard tonight keeping us safe. Emily nodded but stayed by Riley's side, her small hands stroking his fur. Riley leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly before flicking open again at the sound of a car passing outside. Mr. Parsons stood and walked to the window, peering through the curtains into the snow-covered street. His years in law enforcement had taught him not to dismiss instincts, and Riley's reaction to Thomas still gnawed at him. He had seen dogs act on instinct before, but never with this level of intensity or focus. Riley had known something was wrong before anyone else had the slightest clue. The next morning brought a tentative calm. The family woke late, the events of the night before weighing on them as they moved through their usual routines. Emily stayed close to Riley, carrying his bowl of food to him and sitting with him while he ate. The golden retriever seemed to sense her unease, occasionally nudging her with his nose as if to reassure her. Mr. Parsons made a few calls to friends on the force, hoping to learn more about what the police had uncovered. By mid-afternoon, he had answers, though they only deepened his unease. Thomas wasn't a random guest. He had a record of involvement in petty crimes, though nothing as serious as what he had been caught with the previous night. The device he brought was sophisticated, suggesting he hadn't built it alone. "It doesn't make sense," Mr. Parsons said, pacing the living room as he relayed the details to his wife. He wasn't acting alone. Someone put him up to this, or at the very least helped him prepare. But why would they send him here? Mrs. Parsons shook her head, folding her arms as she leaned against the kitchen counter. "You don't think it was just bad luck? That he picked our house at random because we were having a party?" "No," Mr. Parsons replied firmly. Riley knew. From the moment Thomas walked in, Riley knew there was more to him. Dogs don't react like that unless there's a reason. As if sensing his name, Riley lifted his head from where he lay on the rug. He watched Mr. Parsons intently, his ears twitching as though he understood every word. The next few days brought no new revelations, but the sense of unease in the Parsons home didn't fade. Riley stayed alert, spending more time by the windows and occasionally growling at shadows that passed by on the street. Emily stayed close to him, finding comfort in his presence, while Mrs. Parsons tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for her family. On the 5th day after the party, a black sedan appeared on the street outside the Parsons house. It parked several houses down, and a man in a dark suit stepped out, leaning casually against the car as he appeared to make a phone call. Riley, watching from the window, immediately began to growl. Mr. Parsons joined Riley at the window, pulling the curtain back slightly to get a better view. His eyes narrowed as he watched the man. He didn't recognize him, but the way the man scanned the street made it clear he wasn't just a passerby. "Stay here," Mr. Parsons said to his wife as he grabbed his coat. He clipped a leash to Riley's collar, and the golden retriever stood at attention, ready to follow. Outside, the cold air bit at Mr. Parsons' face as he walked down the driveway with Riley at his side. The man in the suit noticed him immediately, his posture stiffening as Mr. Parsons approached. "Can I help you with something?" Mr. Parsons called out, his voice carrying an edge. The man smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Just waiting for someone," he replied, his tone smooth but evasive. "Funny place to wait," Mr. Parsons said, stopping a few feet away. Riley stood between them, his growling low and steady. The man glanced down at the dog, his smile faltering slightly. "Nice dog," he said, taking a step back. "Looks protective." "He is," Mr. Parsons replied, his gaze unwavering, "especially when something doesn't feel right." For a moment, neither man spoke. The tension crackled in the air, and Riley's growl grew louder. Finally, the man shrugged, turning back toward his car. "Well, I won't bother you anymore. Have a good day." Mr. Parsons watched as the man climbed into the sedan and drove off, his grip on Riley's leash tightening. Riley barked once as the car disappeared around the corner, then looked up at Mr. Parsons as if to say, "It's not over yet." Back inside, Mr. Parsons relayed the encounter to his wife, his unease now bordering on alarm. "Something's going on," he said. "That man wasn't just waiting for someone. He was watching." Mrs. Parsons looked at Riley, who had settled by the fireplace but remained alert. "What do we do now?" she asked softly. "We stay vigilant," Mr. Parsons replied, his gaze drifting to Riley. "And we trust him. Riley's the reason we're still safe, and I'm betting he'll let us know if something else is coming." As the family gathered that evening, Riley took his place beside Emily, his body relaxed but his eyes sharp. The Parsons didn't know what lay ahead, but they knew one thing for certain. They would face it together, with their loyal guardian leading the way. The days following the stranger's visit passed with a quiet unease. Snow continued to blanket the neighborhood, muting the outside world, but inside the Parsons' home, tension brewed. Riley's watchfulness hadn't waned. He often sat near the front window, his ears perked, his gaze fixed on the street as if waiting for something. The family tried to move on, but it was clear that no one had truly put the events of the Christmas party behind them. Mr. Parsons spent much of his time making calls to old friends and law enforcement, seeking information on Thomas and the man who had appeared outside their house. What little he uncovered confirmed his suspicions. Thomas was just a pawn in a larger game. The device Thomas had brought was traced back to a group operating in the city, known for smuggling contraband and building weapons for hire. Yet no one could determine why their family had been targeted, or if it had been an accident. Late one evening, while Emily and Mrs. Parsons slept upstairs, Mr. Parsons sat in the living room, staring at the faintly glowing embers in the fireplace. Riley lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws but his eyes open, watching. The quiet of the house was comforting, but it didn't last. A soft thud came from outside, followed by another. Mr. Parsons froze, listening intently. Riley's ears perked, and his body tensed. The golden retriever rose slowly to his feet, a low growl building in his throat. Without making a sound, Mr. Parsons reached for the flashlight he kept by the window and motioned for Riley to stay close. Together, they moved toward the front door. Peering through the peephole, Mr. Parsons saw nothing unusual. The street was empty, the snow undisturbed. Yet Riley's growl persisted, his body rigid. Mr. Parsons cracked the door open, the cold air rushing in as he shone the flashlight across the porch. Something glittered in the snow, a shard of glass, perhaps from a broken bottle, just inches from the welcome mat. "Stay," he whispered to Riley, stepping outside cautiously. The dog obeyed but stood at the threshold, his eyes never leaving his owner. Mr. Parsons scanned the street, his breath visible in the icy air. No movement, no footprints other than his own. He bent down to pick up the glass, only to notice a second shard further down the walkway and another leading toward the side of the house. A trail. He turned back to Riley, whose growl deepened, and nodded. "Let's go." They followed the trail around the side of the house, Riley moving silently at his side. When they reached the backyard, the flashlight caught a faint movement near the fence, a figure slipping through the shadows. Riley barked loudly, breaking the stillness, and the figure froze. "Stop right there," Mr. Parsons called, his voice firm. The figure hesitated before bolting toward the back gate. Riley lunged forward, barking fiercely as Mr. Parsons gave chase. He caught a glimpse of the intruder, a man, wearing dark clothes and a ski mask, just as the gate slammed shut behind him. By the time Mr. Parsons reached the gate, the man was gone, his footprints vanishing into the freshly fallen snow beyond the yard. Riley growled and barked at the gate, pacing back and forth as if willing the man to return. Mr. Parsons placed a calming hand on Riley's back, trying to steady his own racing heartbeat. Inside the house, Mrs. Parsons appeared at the top of the stairs, clutching Emily in her arms. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Someone was outside," Mr. Parsons said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. "They were watching us." "Again?" Mrs. Parsons whispered, holding Emily tighter. The little girl buried her face in her mother's shoulder, her small frame shaking. Mr. Parsons nodded, but Riley scared them off. "They won't be coming back tonight." The next morning, Mr. Parsons called the police to report the incident, though he doubted it would lead to much. He spent hours securing the house, adding extra locks to the doors and reinforcing the windows. Riley stayed close by, watching his every move, as if understanding the importance of the task. That afternoon, A knock at the door startled the family. Mr. Parsons opened it cautiously, relieved to find a familiar face on the other side. Detective Harris, an old friend from his days on the force. "I heard about the break-in attempt," Harris said, stepping inside and shaking the snow off his coat. "Thought I'd check in, see how you're holding up." "We're managing," Mr. Parsons replied, leading Harris into the living room. "But it's clear this isn't over. Someone's watching us." Harris nodded, his expression grim. "We've been digging into Thomas's connections, and you were right, this wasn't random. We don't know why your family was targeted yet, but there's a pattern to their operations. They test boundaries first, see how their targets react before making a bigger move." Mrs. Parsons paled. "So they're coming back?" "It's possible," Harris admitted, glancing down at Riley, who was sitting at Mr. Parsons's feet. "But with this guy around, they're not going to have an easy time of it." Over the next few days, Harris and his team kept a close watch on the neighborhood, patrolling regularly and setting up cameras around the Parsons property. Still, the family remained on edge, their routines disrupted by the lingering threat. Emily refused to sleep without Riley by her side, and Mrs. Parsons found herself checking the locks on the doors multiple times each night. Then, on New Year's Eve, the confrontation finally came. As the clock approached midnight, the Parsons were gathered in the living room, Riley lying in his usual spot by Emily's feet. The neighborhood was quiet, save for the occasional pop of distant fireworks. But just as the countdown to midnight began, Riley bolted upright, barking furiously. His sudden movement startled the family, and Mr. Parsons jumped to his feet. "What is it, boy?" he asked, but Riley was already moving, racing toward the back door. Before Mr. Parsons could follow, the sound of glass shattering filled the air. The family froze as two masked figures burst through the kitchen window, their heavy boots crunching on the shards below. Riley charged at them without hesitation, his ferocious barks echoing through the house. The intruders didn't expect the golden retriever's speed or ferocity. One of them stumbled back, nearly tripping over the broken glass, as Riley lunged, his teeth snapping dangerously close. The other raised a hand, holding a crowbar, but Riley's relentless attack forced him to drop it. Mr. Parsons acted quickly, grabbing the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and swinging it toward the second intruder, who barely dodged the blow. Mrs. Parsons, clutching Emily, shouted for help as she reached for her phone to call the police. Within minutes, the house was filled with chaos, Riley's growls and barks dominating the space as he cornered one of the intruders in the kitchen. The other, panicked, tried to flee but was stopped by Mr. Parsons, who tackled him to the ground. By the time the police arrived, the intruders were subdued, and Riley stood guard, his chest heaving with exertion but his posture unyielding. The officers praised the family's quick thinking and Riley's bravery, calling him the true hero of the night. As the new year began, the Parsons sat together in the living room, shaken but safe. Riley lay at Emily's feet, his head resting on her lap as she stroked his fur. The family knew they owed everything to their loyal companion, whose instincts and courage had protected them once again. "This will be a New Year's Eve we'll never forget," Mr. Parsons said, raising a glass to Riley. "To our hero." Riley wagged his tail, content in the warmth of the family he had fought so hard to protect. Thank you very much for watching the video to the end. If you were moved by the story of the canine hero and the spirit of Christmas that transformed lives, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments what you thought of this exciting journey.